This is The Writing Game, and I'm Gregory Palaci. There's a lot of writing that goes into video games, from design documents to marketing materials to scripts. Yes, scripts. And I want to talk about it all, and I will, well, because it's my show. But given this is the first episode of 2019 and the first in the new monthly release cycle, I thought I'd focus on one particular thing. Exposition. What's exposition, I hear you ask? Why, let me tell you. It's like in the movies where you talk to the audience 90% of the time. You kind of want to stay away from that stuff. But to write exposition brilliantly is hard. Richard Jenkins. Exposition in games comes in three forms. That's not even talking about the marketing materials. In games, we experience exposition in some very specific ways. Description, lore, and dialogue. Now, that all sounds the same because in a lot of ways it is. It's exposition after all. But each has very particular elements to making sure that the exposition doesn't feel like it's exposition. Descriptions are user interface guides, tooltips, mission pointers, and other methods of conveying to the player what needs to be done in the game, or at least in the menu system. One of the very first times you encounter the user interface that says something about the game and how it is played is the difficulty select screen. Granted, the background and the fonts of the main menu help a lot too, but those are aspects that are determined by the UI designer. Take Doom 2016 for example. The phrases, "I'm too young to die" and "hurt me plenty" are so evocative of what this game is about. Even ultra-violence and Nightmare speak to a level of carnage that is all but unbelievable. Compare that with Wolfenstein: The New Order and its descriptions, "Can I play, Daddy?" and "Don't hurt me," which are more dismissive of the players and do little to illustrate what the game is going to be like. Doom's descriptions spoke to the violence to be found in the game, and how no matter what difficulty setting a player chose, there was still going to be said violence, and they were going to encounter a lot of it. Wolfenstein, on the other hand, is stating that the player won't even see anything close to what the developers originally intended when it's saying, "Don't hurt me." But that's not as bad as Metal Gear Solid 5 and the Chicken Hat, which is a constant reminder to the player that they've chosen to play in easier difficulty. The UI doesn't always give you much to work with as a writer. Take Below, for example. It's minimalist in the extreme. And that's not a bad thing. I quite enjoy the aesthetic. In fact, I almost fit within Star Wars. But there are so few details in the UI beyond the names for things that to expect to do storytelling in that manner is ridiculous. Plus, it's not like all the items have interesting names as they do in a game like Destiny 2. On the other end of the spectrum for UI are games like Crusader Kings 2, where there's so much of the interface to deal with and so much information to be conveyed that it can be difficult to fit story and world building details in. Even if you do get such writing into the UI, it can generally be overlooked amongst the mass of data the player has to absorb. That's not to say the work is a loss, just that it won't be as effective as you might hope as a writer. This is, of course, not talking about very specific UI elements, which are story-focused, such as pop-ups indicating events in games like Crusader Kings. Tooltips go one of two ways: dry and boring, or insightful and delightful, the latter being the exception. Why? Probably because they were written last minute by someone who's already overworked, but also because the tooltips are often seen as a means of instruction to the player. Longer descriptions do occur in the UI and outside of tooltips. Destiny 2 and Mass Effect are great examples of this. In the former, certain items don't just have short descriptions, but stories associated with them. The latter has the whole codex to explore. And those are both examples of lore as well. Lore is exposition in games. It's not knowledge that is inherent to the player, though it might become sequential releases. And for some reason, it's generally not even knowledge the player character has. Of course, if it was, then how would the developers do any exposition? That's the difficulty when it comes to lore and using it in games. This is especially true of role-playing games. I see this in the tabletop campaign I run. The player characters are meant to have a history and a knowledge of the world they're in. And like many systems, there are stats associated with that knowledge. But if players don't have an elaborate backstory written for their character, or they are not very well versed in the minutiae of the universe they're playing in, you present them with a problem when they are called upon to have that knowledge. Star Wars Edge of the Empire by Fantasy Flight Games, for example, has knowledge checks, but most players invest little to no points in those stats, meaning they collectively and individually know nothing of where they're from. My remedy for this has been a house rule that every character has at least one rank in knowledge for the area of the galaxy they're from, and a certain amount of inherent knowledge about their specific planet. That works with the storytelling and improv nature of a tabletop RPG, but not within the structure of a video game. Conveying that knowledge in a video game isn't always possible through books and scrolls like in the Elder Scrolls series, nor is it necessarily the smart choice, as it leaves it up to the player to decide whether or not they read those items. So, if it's vital knowledge, then it shouldn't necessarily be hidden behind such a mechanic. That's not to say there isn't value in hiding knowledge from the player or character. That's what twists are for. It's also why dialogue needs to do a lot. Take a look at any game writer's Twitter feed and you'll see them talking about working late trying to shoehorn 4 different purposes into a single line of dialogue. That includes reminding the player of their goal, providing characterization, teaching mechanics, indicating game states, and more. And that dialogue isn't even for the player character. Player character dialogue tends to be very, not empty or vacuous, but beholden to the moment. If it's a quip or response, it's helping to characterize the PC to a limited degree, but it rarely introduces new information. Firewatch, good old, but not really old Firewatch. It does so much so well, and if you haven't played it, you should. At this point, I should also be getting kickbacks from Campo Santo for the amount I actually talk about their game. That aside, I keep looking to Firewatch to make my arguments, or even for inspiration, but it doesn't start with dialogue to illustrate who you are as Henry. That only comes later. The early dialogue in the game is more focused on who Delilah is, setting up her character and her relationship to Henry, in part because we as players are quite aware of who we are, a late 30s, slightly overweight white dude who's running away from a problem. Like Henry, we as a player are in an entirely new setting, so everything we encounter is about learning. But the world isn't so new to us that we have to ask about every tree or rock. Rather, our questions are saved for the elements of the world that have significance associated with them. A great example is the medicine wheel, which you can encounter on day 1. In writing this episode, the thing I kept coming up against was that I'm trying to describe a conundrum that's best experienced, and not necessarily through clips of games that I haven't personally written. Why? Well, because we don't know the constraints the team who worked on that game were under. So while I can direct you to a video like this one, the fact is we don't know why the writing comes across as so poor. Was it the lack of time for edits? Was it only one round of translations? Are the lines actually okay, but the voice actors given poor directions? There are so many variables that can make a single line read as poor, yet fit nicely within the scene. Do everything it needs to story-wise, and provide a bit of characterization. This is why video games are a team effort. It's not just the writer creating those lines. Really, the best thing to do at this stage is to give you a writing exercise. I know, something new for 2019. Homework. With that in mind, having watched the short video of Resident Evil Revelations, the link for it is in the show notes, take a single scene and rewrite it. In doing so, you need to do 3 things. 1. Convey the relevant information to the player, be it about a backstory, an enemy, or the environment. 2. Keep it short. No more than a single sentence, and don't cheat with run-on sentences. You're not Tolstoy. 3. It needs to fit with the character. Having done that, try reading your work out loud, or get someone else to act it out. Is it any better than the original? No judgments if it's not. Don't worry, I won't be subjecting you to my own attempts. So, back to exposition proper. The best explanation of it and how to use it comes from Sean Coyne, author of The Story Grid. Here he is talking about it on the podcast, The Story Grid.
What you're doing, and this is what Robert McKee always, I love this phrase that he uses, is you're using exposition as ammunition. And what that means is that, wouldn't it be
that's one of those things you say all the time that, like, I feel like I know what it means, but I don't actually understand what that means.
Okay. Okay, what it means is that what you could have done in that shaming moment is you could have had the mayor of the town say, and by decree of the authority, I now sentence you to 25 years with the numbered. Bang, and here's your thing, right? And that's boring, right? Because we are so enveloped in her getting that horrible crown put on her head and being stoned and having her hair cut off, that we don't need that extra little thing. The only reason to put that in is to load in exposition, right? And so what people would say to me, another writer would say to me is, but how am I going to let the reader know that she got 25 years? And I would say, well, why don't you use it as exposition as ammunition? And what that means is use that revelation of exposition as a way to turn your story. So
so you're basically saving it for when it's actually useful.
Exactly. Save the secrets, save the information. Remember, information is power. Your reader doesn't have any information. So when you choose to give them information, make choices that you can use to turn your scenes, as opposed to just making stupid, dialogue decrees or, hey, remember, Joe, that time when we were back in college and you had that terrible mononucleosis that you never recovered from? Yeah, I remember that. Anyway, I was thinking of that the other day as I was riding my bike. And we laugh, but you read novel and thing after thing, and those things are in there all the time. And those are the things that readers hate because they see right through it. They know that they're going to have some mononucleosis, subplot come in like 3 or 4 more chapters. And the writer will be, well, I had to lay that in, or they wouldn't get the mononucleosis part. And as an editor, you can say, well, you can't do that. You have to use your exposition as ammunition to turn your scenes into revelations as opposed to that. And then you get the wide-eyed, glassy-eyed look of somebody who doesn't know what the hell you're talking about.
The Story Grid is a book with really solid advice when it comes to crafting stories, and it can be as readily applied to games as it is to novels. Saving information for key moments has to be balanced with laying the groundwork for further story. Where exposition goes wrong is being so deliberate about it that any mention of something not directly related to the main plot tells us, as the audience, that this will come up again. The original Destiny did a lot of exposition during the campaign and strikes, often with Ghost reciting some sort of lore for the sake of the player to have an understanding of what they're going into. While the writing was ostensibly okay, the presentation in this manner was stilted. Case in point,
I've been combing the Cryptarch's records for anything on the Temple of Crota. Listen.
Long ago, the moon fell to Crota. He wielded a sword so dark it drained whatever light it touched. Now Crota sleeps, but the sword does not. The warlocks believe the sword is in a chamber guarded by the Swarm Princes. If you face them and steal the sword, we can see that it is never wielded again.
so there's mention of a sword, a soul-stealing sword, as it were, that was wielded by the big bad, and we have to dispose of it. All fair enough, but the fact is we're told this. We're not shown it, so this exposition falls flat, and it's made worse by the lack of further story elements regarding the sword and tying it to the defeat of Crota. The Destiny series to date has a lot of interesting lore, but it's so hidden from the gameplay and the player's experience, or presented through exposition, that it does little to enhance the story. Far Cry 5, for all its faults, does far better at the use of exposition to span the world, direct players, and make for interesting stories. Saving random NPCs in the world can net you stories of what else is going on in the world, which results in quests. And it's never a simple go to location A to get gun B. Bark. Speaking of barks, those inane comments you hear from NPCs when things change in the world. And that change can be as minute as you walking past an NPC, not just they've been shot or mauled by a bear. It's characters reloading or flanking or commenting on you walking past. Those are not as easy as they seem. How many ways can you think to say hello? Well, you're going to have to. I've got some more homework for you. First, write 5 greetings from 2 different characters. The genders, ages, ethnicities, etc. can and should be different. It doesn't have to be just guard A and guard B. And the reason for that difference is to help you keep track of them as characters. Make sure the greetings are different, but also say something about who those characters are. If it helps, act them out. Second, write 5 lines for each character where they are talking about something other than their job. So it can be a local sports team, their kid, their favorite taco joint, etc. But each of those 5 lines has to be about the same subject. So that's 5 comments about tacos. Really, how hard can that be? Tacos are awesome. Third, write 5 lines for each character, but about the other character. So it can be a question they'd ask, a comment they'd say behind the back of that other character, an in-joke between them, etc. But you can provide context for when such a line would be said, should you need to. There you go, world building and exposition that isn't downright terrible. Now, the trick for that exposition is to work it into the rest of the game and tie it to the story. There'll be more on character dialogue in a future episode. And if you're wondering, no, I did not come up with the term exposition as ammunition. That's all Robert McKee and his book, Dialogue, The Art of Verbal Action for the Page, Stage, and Screen. I haven't read it, so I can't recommend it. For now, thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Palachi. Everything I can do can be found at gregorypalachi.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at OneGameDad if you want to talk writing, games, this show, or even working together. I also have a Patreon that you can support me on. It's patreon.com/OneGameDad. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.